2 years ago, I almost sent a message that would have changed everything. It was 3 in the morning, late January, and I had just had one of those moments of absolute clarity about a situation I had been circling for months. A relationship. The fog lifted. I could see exactly what it was, not what I wanted it to be, not what I was afraid it might be, just what it actually was. Clear. Obvious. Like someone had turned on a light in a room I had been navigating by touch. And in that moment of crystalline clarity, I opened my phone and started typing. I was going to tell the other person exactly what I saw. Every word felt precise. I knew what I knew. The clarity was real. But something stopped me. Not doubt, not second-guessing, something subtler. I could feel that the words on the screen were not carrying the full weight of what I understood internally. The knowing was whole. The language was partial. The gap between what I understood and what I could articulate was enormous. And I had the presence of mind at 3 in the morning to close the app and go to sleep. When I woke up 6 hours later, the clarity was still there, unchanged. But I also understood something I had missed at 3 a.m. The knowing was ready. The communication channel was not. And if I had sent that message in the gap between knowing and articulating, the words would have landed wrong. Not because the insight was wrong, but because language was not yet carrying the signal cleanly. Stay with me on this, because that gap, the space between knowing something clearly and being able to communicate it accurately, is the exact territory Mercury Retrograde occupies. And this particular retrograde is about to amplify that gap to a degree I have not seen in years. Mercury stations retrograde tomorrow, February 25th, 19 degrees Pisces. If you follow astrology content online, you have probably already seen the warnings. Do not sign contracts. Back up your devices. Expect delays and miscommunications. Your ex might text. Maybe all of that is true. I am not going to argue with the basics. But I am also not going to repeat them because that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is context. Mercury goes retrograde 3 times a year. It happens like clockwork. It is the most discussed transit in popular astrology, which also makes it the most diluted. The generic advice about retrogrades gets recycled every 4 months with slightly different wording and the same warnings. Most of that content is not wrong exactly. It is just incomplete. Because Mercury retrograde is not one thing. It depends entirely on what else is happening in the sky. A retrograde in a quiet field is a speed bump. A retrograde inside an active field is a different animal entirely. In the field right now is not quiet. Yesterday I walked you through what happened on February 20th when Saturn met Neptune at 0 degrees Aries. If you missed that video, the short version is this. The conjunction delivered crystallization, not dissolution. People reported clarity arriving, structures forming, fog lifting, decisions that had been suspended for months suddenly making themselves. I tracked dozens of observations and the pattern was consistent. Something landed. Something became real. That conjunction is still active right now, still within 1 degree of exact. The energy field is still radiating. And into this freshly poured foundation, Mercury is about to reverse course and spend 23 days walking backward through the construction zone. Here is where it lands. The conjunction gave you clarity. The retrograde is going to test whether you can hold that clarity without being able to explain it clearly. Because Mercury in Pisces retrograde specifically disrupts the translation layer, not the knowing layer, not the intuition layer, the translation layer, the part that converts internal understanding into external expression, words, emails, conversations, explanations. That layer is about to get noisy for 3 weeks. I want to be precise about the mechanics because precision is what separates useful astrology from noise. Mercury retrograde in Pisces operates differently from Mercury retrograde in other signs. Pisces is already the sign where language struggles. It is the sign of the felt sense, the nonverbal, the thing you know but cannot prove. Mercury in Pisces at its best communicates through image, metaphor, art, music, the kinds of expression that bypass linear language. Mercury in Pisces at its worst confuses the felt sense with the articulated sense and sends messages that make perfect sense internally but arrive as gibberish externally. Now add retrograde motion. The function that translates knowing into words is not just operating in a nonlinear sign, it is operating backward in a nonlinear sign. Inside a field where major structural clarity just arrived. The result is a very specific kind of frustration. You know exactly what you mean. You cannot make anyone else understand. Not because they're not listening, because the signal is getting scrambled between your knowing and your mouth, between your insight and your keyboard. There is a distinction I want to draw here, because it is going to save some of you real trouble over the next 3 weeks. There is a difference between a clarity problem and a communication problem. A clarity problem means you do not know. You are confused. The insight has not arrived yet. A communication problem means you know but cannot express it. The insight is solid, but the words are broken. These two things feel completely different internally, but they can look identical from the outside. And Mercury retrograde inside the conjunction field specifically creates communication problems, not clarity problems. The conjunction delivered clarity. That clarity is real. It is not going anywhere. But the retrograde is going to make it temporarily impossible to communicate that clarity cleanly. And here is the trap. When you cannot explain something clearly, the natural human response is to doubt whether you actually understand it. The words are not working, therefore, maybe the idea is not sound. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe the decision was premature. Maybe the clarity was just a feeling, and feelings are unreliable. That is the retrograde talking. That doubt is not evidence. It is noise on the line. And if you respond to that noise by reversing the decisions that arrived with the conjunction, you will regret it by mid-March when the channel clears. Let me give you the practical version of how this plays out. 3 scenarios I am already seeing form in the shadow period. First, the announcement trap. Something crystallized for you around February 20th. A decision, a direction, a structural change. The natural impulse is to tell people, announce it, share the clarity, start conversations. Mercury retrograde in this field specifically punishes premature announcements, not because the decision is wrong, because the words you choose during retrograde will not carry the full signal. They will be heard differently than intended. They will raise questions you cannot answer clearly, not because you do not know the answers, but because the translation layer is disrupted. If something arrived on February 20th, the time to communicate it is after March 20th, when Mercury stations direct. Between now and then, act on the clarity silently. Build the structure, take the steps, but do not narrate the process publicly until the channel clears. Second, the revision trap. You will receive messages during this retrograde that ask you to revisit, revise, reconsider. Old conversations will resurface. People from past chapters will appear. Documents will need editing. Projects will require reworking. This is standard retrograde territory, but inside the conjunction field it has a twist. The revision requests will feel like they are challenging the new structure, like the universe is asking you to go back to the old version. It is not. It is asking you to refine the foundation, not rebuild it, not abandon it. Refine. There is a difference between revision and reversal. Revision says the structure is sound, the details need adjustment. Reversal says the structure is wrong, start over. Mercury Retrograde suggests revision. Do not upgrade it to reversal. Third, the intimacy gap. Pisces retrograde specifically affects emotional communication. Relationships that became clear around the conjunction will hit a period where both people know what they feel, but cannot find the language to bridge the gap. Conversations will stall. Misunderstandings will multiply. Not because the feelings changed, but because the translator is offline. If you are in a relationship that crystallized or clarified recently, the next 3 weeks are not the time to have the big talk. Let the clarity sit. Let it deepen. Let the words catch up to the knowing. The relationship is not regressing. The communication is buffering. There's one more layer I want to add because the timing is extraordinary. Today is February 24th. The ancient Romans held a festival around this date called the Terminalia, dedicated to Terminus, the god of boundaries. But the Terminalia was not about building boundaries. It was about walking them, verifying them. Once a year, neighbors would walk their shared property lines together, not to fight, but to confirm. This is where my land ends. This is where yours begins. Is the map still accurate? Does the structure still hold? If something had shifted since the last verification, the boundary got redrawn based on what was actually true. That is exactly what Mercury retrograde inside the conjunction field is doing. The conjunction built the new structure, delivered the new boundary. The retrograde walks the line, tests the edges, asks, is this real? Does this hold? Where does the new structure begin and the old one end? And just like the Terminalia, you have to walk it yourself. You cannot send a representative. You cannot outsource the verification. The noise of the retrograde is the vibration running through the foundation. The foundation that survives the vibration is the one you build on. 3 signals to watch starting tomorrow. First, watch for the gap between knowing and speaking. If you find yourself saying, I know what I mean, but the words are not coming out right, that is the retrograde interacting with the conjunction field. Do not mistake a translation problem for a clarity problem. Write down what you know, even if the language is messy. The knowing underneath the messy words is real. Second, watch for people from the past surfacing with unfinished business. This is Mercury retrograde doing its standard work. But inside the conjunction field, the unfinished business will specifically relate to boundaries and structures that were foggy before and are now clear. The past is not returning. It is coming back for verification. Third, watch for the urge to explain yourself. The conjunction gave you clarity. The retrograde will create pressure to justify that clarity to others, to explain, to defend, to convince. Resist that pressure. Clarity does not need permission. And the more you try to explain it through a disrupted channel, the more distorted the message becomes. By Friday, Mars squares Uranus while Mercury is freshly retrograde. And retrograde Mercury inside a Mars-Uranus field creates a very specific kind of disruption that I want to walk you through before it hits. That is tomorrow's territory. I have been tracking retrogrades for over a decade, and there is something I have noticed that never gets discussed. The retrogrades people dread the most turn out to be the ones that produce the best outcomes long term. Not because suffering builds character, because the communication disruption forces you to sit with the knowing longer than you would have otherwise. You cannot share it yet, so you have to live with it. And living with clarity without being able to externalize it does something. It deepens. It roots. It moves from understanding to embodiment, from concept to bone-level knowing. The decisions that survive 3 weeks of retrograde noise without being spoken, without being justified, without being explained to anyone, those are the ones you never second-guess. Because by the time the channel clears and you finally have the words, the structure is not just understood, it is inhabited. For today, here's where it lands. Mercury retrograde is not the problem. The problem is confusing a communication disruption with a clarity disruption. What arrived on February 20th is real. The structure is sound. The decision is made. Mercury is just going to spend 3 weeks making it difficult to talk about. Let it be difficult. Let the silence hold. Let the knowing exist without narration. The words will come. They always do. But they come on Mercury's schedule, not yours. That is the pattern. And now you know where to look.